Thank you, Mr. Howarth. It's a pleasure to serve under your chairmanship.
Yeah.
And I'm very happy to move that this House has discussed Russia and the Council of Europe. First, can I start this by thanking so many members of the Council for joining me here this morning to discuss this issue. It's a great pleasure to see them, and I'm very grateful for them turning up to speak in this. I need, I think, to start this by making two declarations, neither of which is required for financial reasons, but I make them to offer some context to the debate. The first of these is, as I've already said, I am a member of the Parliamentary Assembly of the Council of Europe. And just to set the scene a little, the Council of Europe was established to promote the rule of law, democracy, and human rights throughout post-war Europe. And it is no less relevant today than it was 70 years ago. And it has become the premier human rights forum in Europe throughout its now 47 member states. And that's an important point when we come to discuss Russia. The Council of Europe is a bicameral institution that includes member countries from across the wider Europe, not just from the EU. That Europe includes Turkey and countries of the former Soviet Union, such as Ukraine, Georgia, Azerbaijan and Armenia, some of which I will mention during the course of my speech. It also includes a number of partners in democracy and other observers, including Japan, the US, Mexico, Canada, as well as important other countries such as Israel and the representative of the Palestinians. There are also a number of other institutions with which the Council of Europe has a relationship. These include the European Court of Human Rights. And it's important to remember that we, as members of the Parliamentary Assembly, elect the judges to the European Court of Human Rights. And this gives the judges, and therefore the whole of the court, a significant democratic legitimacy. And this will be relevant later when we come to discuss Russian involvement. If the United Kingdom is indeed to be part of the wider Europe, then the Council of Europe offers a tailor-made vehicle for so doing. Rather than seeking to reinvent the wheel, we need to strengthen and to maximise the UK's unique status within the Council, including on Russia. The second thing that I wish to declare is that before I entered Parliament, I was the principal private sector advisor on matters East European, including the former USSR, for successive UK governments of both colours. In this role, I helped set up and steer the technical assistance programmes that we set up to help these countries develop. And the sort of work that we did included a range of activities, including, for example, work on privatisation throughout the whole of the region. Now, Russia, too, is a member of the Council of Europe, but it has chosen not to put forward its delegation to the Parliamentary Assembly for approval. It's worth just repeating that. Russia has chosen to absent itself from the Parliamentary Assembly by not allowing its delegation to be questioned and approved, presumably in fear of reaction to its continued occupation of large parts of Ukraine, and that's not just the Crimea, but large parts of Ukraine, including the eastern Ukraine in the Donbass. It has subsequently chosen not to pay the Council of Europe its annual dues as a grand payeur, which was originally set at 33 million euros. So we are running short of 33 million euros in the Council of Europe because of Russia's decision not to pay up. And the Council of Europe is now under tremendous pressure to readmit Russia in order for it to start paying again. In other words, just a second. In other words, we are being asked to sacrifice principle for cash. I give way.
To be absolutely fair, we took away their voting rights.
No.
I will come on to that in just a minute. We did take away their voting rights, because of the invasion of Ukraine, which was not the first time that Russia had done something like this. And I will come on to explain that in a minute. But we are dealing with a serial offender when it comes to this. And I want to look at this issue, because prior to all this happening, the Council, as my honourable friend has already said, the Council did vote to take away Russia's voting rights, and it has now also lost its rights to elect judges to the European Court of Human Rights. This has occurred after Russia moved in and annexed Crimea and took action in eastern Ukraine. Now, the Russian ambassador to the Council of Europe has written that this was the free choice by the people of Crimea to become part of Russia, and that the Assembly had so restricted the rights of its representatives that they could not continue. I think the first part of that is, quite frankly, a laughable description of the situation that occurred. It is possible, with the benefit of hindsight, to argue that when the USSR broke up, we should not have simply accepted the countries that were based on the former component states of the former USSR, but to do otherwise would have complicated a very complex situation, and it would also have delayed the emergence of independent nation states. And at the time, I do remember discussing this issue and passing it by. The fact is that Russian activity in the Donbass and in Crimea has badly affected the human rights of Ukrainians who are there, some of which are being held as political prisoners. Members here may recall the opportunity we had to meet Nadia Savchenko, a member of the Council of Europe and a Ukrainian Air Force pilot who had been imprisoned by the Russians, and who, after her release, came to address the Council. Now, one may agree with Nadia Savchenko or one may not agree with her politics, but that is irrelevant. The fact is she gave a very moving account of her imprisonment by the Russians. Of course.
I'm extremely grateful to my honourable friend. He's making a very powerful speech. Does he agree with me that the invasion of Crimea was the tipping point, the supine response by the international community to the taking of two enclaves in Georgia, in South Ossetia and Abkhazia? That is when we should have first acted. And the invasion of Crimea simply followed by the fact that we refused to do anything when they invaded those parts of Georgia.
I thank my right honourable friend very much for that intervention, and he anticipates what I'm going to say in a moment about that. But I do agree with him that, as I said to the earlier intervention, we are dealing with a serial offender here. We are dealing with an offender that has already attacked Georgia, and we should have taken a strong stance then. And it comes as no surprise that it has attacked bits of the Ukraine. Of course.
I'm grateful to my honourable friend for getting away, and he indeed is making a powerful speech. Would he agree with me that it is to be welcomed that at the recent NATO conference that Georgia was actually in the forefront of some of the discussions, including a report from the Special Committee? And does he agree that we ought to get on with allowing Georgia into NATO?
I agree with my right honourable friend. I do agree that Georgia is fit for membership of NATO. I think, like her, I am looking forward to going out to monitor the elections later in the year. And I've no idea what I'm going to find on the ground there, but I think it is a very important role that we play as members of the Council of Europe in going out to monitor the elections in countries that have newly emerged as democracies. Now, many may also recall the motion at the last part session of the Council which took up the case of Ukrainian prisoners of war generally. And as I said at the meeting in the Parliamentary Assembly, this is an issue, the issue of political prisoners is an issue which goes right to the heart of what the Council is all about. But this resolution, like the many which the Council have passed condemning the actions of Russia, will almost certainly simply be ignored. The fact is that the Council has passed so many resolutions on the question of occupied Ukrainian territory, on the rights of the people there, and of political prisoners, that Russia's non-compliance with them can only be seen as a gesture of ill will to the Council. But it, of course.
Would you agree, or do you think that, given that a British citizen has now died as a result of the Novichok incident, that perhaps we should be reconsidering Russia's position with the Council of Europe?
Well, I will come on to look at that. I wondered whether she meant we should be considering to admit them or to exclude them. I mean, the Novichok case was a case that I put to the Croatian Prime Minister at the last meeting in public session of how of whether he thought that his decision to send out a Russian member of the Foreign Office that was based there had justifiable reasons for doing that. And his response was that the evidence that had been produced and had been shown by Britain was so strong that he would do it again. And I think that that's a really important element to bring into this. But it is not just the case of Crimea that is the source of disagreement. The persecution of LGBT people in Chechnya is another area. This is an area where the Council has passed a resolution about the serious, systematic and widespread discrimination and harassment of LGBT people, which has caused over 100 LGBT people to flee the country. The Council called on Russia to conduct an independent national investigation. The Council has also called for the discrimination which took place to end. And that discrimination was extreme. But it has done nothing. In the case of Georgia, which we've already mentioned, the Council has also criticised Russia for the abuse of human rights in the occupied regions. This abuse extends effectively to the use of war in its whole country, to its non-recognition of the borders of Georgia itself, and to the treatment of people that live there who have seen their human rights abused. As the Georgian ambassador to the UK has recently written, after 10 years of Russian aggression, Russia continues its occupation of regions of Georgia, undermining international law and the rules-based system, with massive infringements of human rights. Another issue is the Smolensk plane crash, which killed the Polish President Lech Kaczynski, and the Russian refusal to return the wreckage. Now, I understand that the Russians claim that the return of the wreckage will simply fuel Polish conspiracy theories. They may be right on that, but the return of the wreckage may prove beyond doubt what happened in that plane crash, and they should certainly do that. But it is Ukraine which has become the cause célèbre of this debate. As the paper produced at the last meeting of the Council says, some 64 Ukrainians have received politically motivated convictions and are effectively prisoners of war, whose human rights have simply been killed off. The Secretary-General of the Council of Europe has said that the continued absence of Russia from the Council affects the rights of ordinary people in Russia to access the European Court of Human Rights. Given that this statement can be believed, and I think it is a statement that is so far away from the truth, it is difficult to justify that in terms of what can occur. And indeed, having said that, the number of cases that were brought before the European Court of Human Rights for involving Russia was certainly very large. It is worth, too, looking at the total disregard for judgments of the ECHR by Russia, and the claim by the Russian Constitutional Court that Russia should not be bound by its judgments. We know from the judgment in the Yukos oil company case that was heard by the ECHR that following the rules of the ECHR and putting right what the ECHR had already opined on is going to be expensive. But I'm afraid I regard that as a fair price for the Wild West nature of Russia that we helped create after the fall of communism. We got it wrong. Of course, of course.
No one doubts that the human rights record of Russia is egregious, and one can go on listing forever their faults, as many faults of countries like Azerbaijan in the Council of Europe. But he's not so surely suggesting that the Foreign Office should stop talking to Russia or should stop engaging with them. In the same way, in the interparliamentary union, at least if one engages with them, despite their faults, one might have some chance of persuading them round to at least inform them of our point of view.
I think my honourable friend makes an interesting point there, but we are not simply engaging with Russia as a third party. We are talking about the inclusion or the readmission of Russia into the very body of which we are part, of which we were in 1949 and inspiration. And I think that those are completely different circumstances to the sort of description that he makes, whereby we should talk to Russia continually, but this is about admitting them into our family home, as it were, and being part of that. And I think different rules apply in that situation. Now, what I was going to say was, in talking about our role in the fall of communism, we got it right in Poland. We got it right in the Czech Republic. But I fully acknowledge my part in getting it wrong in Russia. The promise to amend the Russian constitution to allow judgments to be implemented, we await with bated breath. So what do we do? The first thing that I think is not going to happen is simply lifting the sanctions that we imposed against Russia's voting rights at the Council and the restoration of those voting rights. The second thing that I simply don't believe is going to happen is the sudden withdrawal of Russia from the Donbass or from the Crimea. Can it be right for members of the Council of Europe simply to invade another's territory, to conduct hateful campaigns elsewhere in the region, and to have a casual attitude to human rights and not suffer any consequences? Are we simply to roll over and admit Russia to the Council without any effects? Is the cost of keeping Russia out of the Council completely out of kilter with the benefits of bringing it back in? The answer to all these questions is, I think, no. And I would add, is it true that the Council cannot survive without the presence of Russia? Again, I think the answer to that question is also no. Now, the Russian ambassador to the Council has said, in seeking to, and I quote, punish, unquote, the delegation of the Russian Parliament in 2014 to 15 for the free choice by the people of Crimea to become part of Russia, the Assembly restricted the rights of Russian parliamentarians to such an extent that it made it impossible for them to continue their work in peace. Nothing could be further from the truth. The Russians have chosen to exclude themselves. He goes on to describe the actions of the Parliamentary Assembly as thoughtless, but they were not. They were a deliberate reaction to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which the Council can hopefully help to reverse. The depriving of the Council of 33 million euros is a serious matter, but it should not stand in the way of the wholesale reform of the Council of Europe, which many of us have argued for. I do not see that it is right to simply sit there and plan for nothing to happen at the end of next year. I do not see that that is a realistic option. I do not see it as realistic that the Council should have no contingency plan for what should happen if the Russians continue. Of course.
I thank my honourable friend for giving way. My honourable friend is making a very powerful point. The Council of Europe, at the moment, it looks as though we're being held hostage by a concerted effort by the Russians through friends in the Council of Europe to get themselves back into the Council of Europe. We are doing this, as far as I can see, under the Secretary-General because he feels that the money is more important than political will to actually say no. Would my honourable friend agree with that? on that.
I do agree with that. And the point that I would make about that is that the Council of Europe is all about political will. It was set up with that background. And if we give in to that political will, we have nowhere to go. And what is required is a proper plan to reduce the waste and inefficiency of the Council in order to take out the expenditure that I'm sure that we can replace the Russian contribution. And I believe overall that we are right to maintain our position of principle and reject this choice of cash.
Well done.